Imagine a time of chaos and oppression, where a brutal army, led by a ruthless commander, subjugates an entire people for decades. Who could get up against such strength? A great king? A legendary warrior? No. The surprising answer is a woman. Deborah, judge and prophetess of Israel, challenged all expectations in leading her people to victory against an enemy considered invincible. Its story is not just an old account, it is a powerful testimony of faith, courage and female leadership. If you have already felt small in the face of a big challenge, this account will show you that the strength to win can come from where least expected. How could this woman inspire an army, overcome gigantic obstacles and ensure the liberation of Israel? And what can this trajectory teach to your life today? Get ready to dive into Deborah's history, understand the details of this epic battle and find out how divine intervention has turned a scenario of defeat into one of the most striking victories in the Bible. In the end, you will see that leadership and courage has nothing to do with gender but with purpose. Let's go together on this journey. Deborah was not just a wise woman, but a true leadership reference in Israel. At a time when society was dominated by men, she stood out as a judge and prophetess, guiding her people in times of crisis. Its influence went beyond the court where it resolved disputes. She was a voice of God to the nation. Its example shows that leadership is not limited to labels or cultural expectations, but the ability to listen, act, and inspire. Israel lived under the oppression of the Canaanites, and despair took over the people. Even so, Deborah remained firm, exercising her authority with discernment and courage. His stance teaches us that, in the midst of adversity, there is always room for leaders who trust God and assume the responsibility to make a difference. If she, in such an unfavorable context, has been able to be a transformative influence, which prevents you from doing the same in your reality. The most impressive in Deborah was her ability to balance firmness and sensitivity. She did not rule by brute force but for wisdom and divine direction. Her role as a prophetess made her a direct channel between God and Israel, and that made all the difference. How many times do we feel lost, not knowing which direction to go? Deborah's history reminds us that when we seek guidance in God, we find clarity to lead and make assertive decisions. His journey inspires us to break limits and challenge expectations. A sociedad pod 8 tentar imperbereres, mosquem temum proposito bem definido semper in contra caminho. Deborah proved that female leadership is not only possible but essential. And you? Este disposto a assumir aposiceo que deus te chamu para ocupar? For 20 years, Israel suffered under the cruel domain of the Canaanites. Commander Sisera, known for his brutality, led a seemingly unbeatable army with 900 iron cars, a far superior war technology than the Israelites had. This scenario generated fear and despair among the people, who saw their looted lands and their freedom crushed. It seemed impossible to reverse the situation. But history teaches us that however dark the night, light always finds a way to shine. Oppression was not only military but also psychological. The Israelites were used to being defeated, to live under constant threat. When fear settles in the heart of a nation, he paralyzes and steals hope. How many times do we feel that way, facing problems that seem insurmountable giants? The challenges may be different, but the feeling of impotence is the same. However, change always begins when someone decides to no longer accept this reality. As Sisera strengthened, Israel weakened, but something was about to change. Often oppression grows up to the maximum before great liberation. This pattern is repeated in history and life. The most intense difficulties usually precede the moments of greater transformation. The question is, are we ready to act when this turn is present? Israel needed a brave leader to break this cycle of fear and submission. And it was in this scenario of despair that Deborah came into action. God did not choose a king, a muscular warrior, or someone who was already on the battlefield. He chose a woman of faith and vision. This proves that when the right time comes, no matter who you are in the eyes of the world, if God gets you up, no one can stop you. Deborah was about to change Israel's fate. Have you ever stopped to think that maybe God is calling you to be the change in your own story? Prolonged suffering caused the Israelites to finally turn their eyes to God. After years of oppression, they understood that the only way out was not in their military strength or strategy, but in divine intervention. How many times do we only seek God when we reach the limit? Pain has this power to remind us of where true help comes from. The clamor of the people was not ignored, and God answered, raising Deborah to lead liberation. This moment marks an important spiritual principle. Before victory comes the cry. God already knew the affliction of Israel, but waited for the people to recognize his need. The same happens with us. Many times we go through crises until we understand that we cannot solve everything alone. The first step to transformation always begins with a surrendered heart. And when we cry out with sincerity, God moves in ways we can't imagine. Deborah, as a prophetess, was the spokesman for the divine response. Imagine the responsibility of carrying such an important message. But this is how God acts. He uses ordinary people to perform extraordinary deeds. Deborah was not intimidated by the challenge. Instead of questioning if she was able, she trusted what God was doing. Does we often still act because we are hoping to be good enough instead of trusting divine training? If you are in a difficult situation, remember every great liberation begins with a sincere cry. God still hears prayers and responds at the right time. For Israel, the answer came through an unlikely leader, showing that he works in unexpected ways. And in your life, are you willing to deliver your challenges into him and trust that the answer will come, even if it is not the way you expect it? Deborah, guided by God, called Barak and handed him a clear mission to gather 10,000 soldiers and face the Canaanite army. The order seemed absurd. How could a group of poorly equipped warriors defeat an enemy with iron cars? The challenge was great, but the divine promise was greater. God had already decreed the victory. It was left to decide whether to have enough faith to obey. Here is a powerful lesson. Often our victory has already been guaranteed, but we need to take the step of courage to take it. However, Barak hesitated. Instead of simply accepting the call and leading the battle, he imposed one condition: he would only go with him. This shows that despite his courage, there were still doubts and insecurities in his heart. Who never felt like this? When God calls us to something big, the natural tendency is to seek guarantees, trying to rely on someone stronger. But the true strength is not who accompanies us, but who sent us. Deborah agreed to go with Barak, but made it clear that because of this hesitation, the glory of victory would not be his, but of a woman. This detail may seem small, but it teaches something deep. God acts in unexpected ways and does not depend on titles or positions. When someone does not assume the role to which he was called, he raises another person to fulfill his purpose. God's plan always materializes, with or without our participation. Barak, despite his moment of weakness, decided to obey and gathered the soldiers for the battle. He may have started with fear but made the decision to move forward. And that is what really matters. Faith is not the absence of fear but the choice to move on despite it. Perhaps you are facing a big challenge now. Is it not time to stop hesitation and act, trusting that God has already secured his victory? The battle was about to begin, and it was indicated that the Israelites would be crushed. How could an army without war cars defeat the dreaded Canaanites? But Deborah had already received the divine promise. Victory was certain. This is a pattern that is repeated in biblical history. God does not choose the strongest, but those who trust in him. How many times do we look at our limitations and forget that when God is in control, do probabilities fail to import? At the decisive moment, something unexpected happened. The Kison River, which was usually quiet, suddenly overflowed. The waters dragged the iron cars of the Canaanites, turning their biggest advantage into a big problem. That advanced technology which so terrorized the Israelites became useless. This teaches us that when we trust God, he can turn the game in ways we would never imagine. Sometimes our greatest weakness can become the key to victory. With the enemies in despair, the army of Barak advanced and defeated them completely. It was an overwhelming victory. But realize something interesting: the struggle required faith and action. God secured the victory, but the soldiers still had to fight. This applies to our life as well. We often want God to solve everything, but he expects us to do our part. Faith is not passivity, it is trusting as we move on. The enemy army was destroyed, but the battle was not completely ended. The commander Sisera, seeing that everything was lost, fled on foot. Even so, Deborah's promise was still standing. The honor of the final victory would not be from Barak, but of a woman. What seemed impossible was coming true. And once again, God was about to act in a surprising way. Have you noticed how he uses the details to fulfill his plans? Defeated and desperate, Sisera abandoned her powerful army and fled on foot. The great commander who once terrorized Israel was now reduced to a weak man running for his own life. This teaches us something valuable: human power is nothing before God's will. As strong as a threat seems today, when God decides to act, Even the greatest enemy can be overthrown. What was once an unbeatable oppression turned into ruins before the eyes of the Israelites. Exhausted, Sisera found refuge on Jael's tent, a seemingly harmless woman. The important detail here is that Jael was Heber's wife, a Kenite who had good relations with the Canaanites. This made Sisera feel safe, without realizing that her destination was already sealed. Esse eam lembrit de que a verdadeira força nem sempre está onde imaginamos. Deus escolhe instrumentos improváveis para realizar seus propósitos e Jael estava presta a se tornar peccacheve nessa história. She welcomed Sisera, gave her milk to drink and let him rest. He, fully trusting her, lay down and fell asleep. Mas enquanto ele dormia, Jael tomou uma estica e martelo e, como unico golpe certeiro, cravou a estica sua cabeça, matando instantaneamente. Thus Deborah's prophecy was fulfilled. The glory of the final victory would not be Barak, but of a woman. Esse momento nos ensina que Deus pode usar qualquer pessoa para cumprir seus planos e, muitas vezes, ele age através daqueles que o mundo ignora. Shortly thereafter Barak arrived, still chasing Sisera. Jael went out and showed the body of the enemy commander. The battle was officially closed. What seemed impossible had happened. Israel, a people without significant military power, defeated a very strong army because God was by his side. How many times do we underestimate what can God do through us? Jael was an ordinary woman, but took a courageous attitude. Isn't it time for you to boldly act on the challenges too? After the great victory, Deborah and Barak not only celebrated, they turned the moment into praise to God. Thus was born the Song of Deborah, an anthem of gratitude and recognition for divine intervention. This song was not just an account of the battle, but a powerful reminder that it was God who gave the victory. How many times after overcoming a challenge we forget to thank? Deborah teaches us that the true celebration is not only in conquest, but in the recognition of those who have been in control all the time. The song also exalted the brave who were willing to fight. Deborah made a point of mentioning those who rose with bravery and also those who, out of fear or indifference, did not participate in the battle. This part of the anthem makes us reflect when God calls us to act. Do we choose to be protagonists or just spectators? History is written by those who decide to trust and move forward, even when everything seems impossible. Another striking detail of the song was the mention of women who played a crucial role in victory. Deborah and Jael were exalted as God's instruments to free Israel. In a patriarchal society, this was extraordinary. This emphasis on female leadership reminds us that God does not see how men see, he uses who is willing, regardless of gender, position, or social condition. If he called you something, don't let human standards limit what he wants to do through his life. The celebration marked the beginning of a new time for Israel. The victory against Sisera was not only military but spiritual and moral. The fear that previously dominated the people was replaced by faith and hope. Deborah's song served as a memorial for future generations, ensuring that no one would forget what God had done. Isso nos ensina principio essential lembrar das vitórias do passado fortalece nossa fé para enfrentar os desafios do futuro. Você tem registrado as suas vitórias e aprendido com elas? After the victory against the Canaanites, Israel enjoyed 40 years of peace under Deborah's leadership. His government was marked by justice, wisdom, and above all obedience to God. She not only set her people free from oppression, but also guided him to a time of stability and prosperity. This proves that a true leader is not just the one who wins battles, but the one who knows how to lead his nation to a better future. And this lesson goes for all of us. It is not enough to overcome challenges, something lasting is needed. Deborah's impact was even greater because she broke barriers. At a time when women hardly exerted positions of authority, she stood out as a judge, prophetess, and military strategist. This teaches us that God's purpose does not respect cultural limitations or human expectations. He gets up who he wants, whenever he wants, and uses unlikely people to perform great achievements. If he called you for something, no matter what the world says, it matters what he has stated about his life. Deborah also inspires us to be God's instruments to free and encourage others. His leadership was not based on pride or pursuit of power, but on service and commitment to his mission. We are often tempted to think only of our own struggles, but is there no one around us needing our guidance and support? The true leadership is not to send but to serve. Who can you inspire with your example today? Deborah's legacy lives to this day, proving that courage and faith are more powerful than any limitation imposed by society. His story challenges us to look beyond difficulties and believe that God can do the impossible. If a woman among an oppressed people has managed to change the story of their nation, imagine what God can do through you. Aquesto e você está disposto a confiar e agir? Deborah's story teaches us that leadership, courage, and faith do not depend on external circumstances, but on an inner conviction that God has control of all things. Faced with a powerful enemy, she did not retreat, did not doubt, and did not wait for someone else to take responsibility. Instead, he trusted the divine promise, took the lead, and inspired an entire people to fight for their liberation. And you? How many battles have you given up facing it because you thought it wasn't able? How many times have looked at your limitations and forgot that God can act through you just as you did with Deborah? If there is anything that this story teaches us, is that no one is too small to be used by God. The secret is to trust, take the first step, and allow Him to do the rest. Now it's your turn to act. If this content inspired you, share in the comments which lesson has marked you the most and how you want to apply in your life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any video, and leave your like to support this work. Just as Deborah has inspired a generation, you can also be a transformation channel by spreading this message.